There is a particular kind of person who walks into a room and within a few minutes has formed an impression of everyone in it that turns out almost always to be more accurate than the impressions formed by people who have known those same individuals for years. They are not reading body language in the deliberate way that self-help books describe. They are not running through checklists of behavioral cues or applying conscious analytical frameworks to what they observe. They are doing something that feels, from the inside, much more like receiving than analyzing, something more like recognition than deduction, and the accuracy of what they perceive is not incidental. It comes from a capacity that Carl Jung identified as one of the most important and most consistently undervalued forms of human intelligence. Jung spent decades in the practice of reading people, not in the superficial sense of that phrase, not in the sense of identifying tricks and tells and surface-level patterns that allow you to make quick judgments about strangers, but in the deepest sense, the sense of genuinely encountering another person's psychological reality, of perceiving the structure of their inner life, the shape of their wounds and their defenses, and their genuine strengths, and their deepest motivations, in a way that goes far beyond what they are consciously presenting to the world. What allowed Jung to do this was not a special gift that only unusually talented people can develop. It was the result of a very specific kind of work that he had done on himself, a work that he believed was not only possible for anyone who was genuinely willing to undertake it, but that was, in fact, the only reliable path toward the kind of genuine human perception that allows you to actually encounter another person, rather than simply encountering your own projections, assumptions, and reflexive judgments about them. This video is not a guide to manipulation or a set of techniques for gaining advantage over others by understanding them better than they understand themselves. Jung would have found that use of psychological understanding genuinely disturbing, and it deserves to be named as a misuse rather than an application of what depth psychology actually offers. What this video is an exploration of what it actually means to be able to read another person with genuine accuracy, what makes that possible, what consistently gets in the way, and what the development of that capacity actually requires of the person who wants to genuinely possess it. Number 1, why most people cannot read others as well as they think they can. The first and most important thing to understand about the ability to accurately read another person is the primary obstacle to it, which is not a lack of observational skill or insufficient knowledge of psychology. It is something much more fundamental and much less frequently acknowledged. It is the fact that most of what we perceive in other people is not actually what is there. It is what we are putting there. Jung called this projection, the unconscious process by which we attribute to others the qualities, feelings, motivations, and characteristics that belong to our own unacknowledged inner life. It is not a rare or pathological phenomenon. It is, for the unexamined psyche, the default mode of perception. We see in others what we most need to see, what we most fear, what we most want, what we most have denied in ourselves, and we experience these perceptions as accurate readings of the other person, rather than as expressions of our own inner world wearing the other person's face. The implications of this for the ability to read people are enormous. If the primary mechanism through which you perceive others is projection, then the more psychologically developed a person you encounter, the more you will systematically misread them. Because the more complex their actual inner life, the greater the gap between what you are projecting onto them and what is actually there. You will feel confident in your reading. You will feel that you understand them. What you will actually be understanding is yourself, reflected back through the medium of their presence. Jung observed this consistently in his clinical work. People came to him with very definite ideas about the people in their lives, the critical colleague, the unavailable partner, the judgmental parent. And in almost every case, as the work progressed and the person began to develop a genuine relationship with their own shadow material, what had seemed like an accurate perception of the other person began to reveal itself as something quite different. The criticism they had experienced as coming from the colleague was, in significant part, the criticism they had never been able to direct at themselves. The unavailability they had experienced in the partner was, in significant part, their own unavailability to their own inner life. The judgment they had experienced from the parent was, in significant part, the judgment they had been carrying toward themselves for longer than they could remember. This does not mean that the colleague was not critical, or the partner not sometimes unavailable, or the parent not genuinely judgmental. The external reality was real, but it was being amplified and distorted by projection in a way that made accurate perception of the actual person virtually impossible. Number 2. What you must understand about yourself before you can understand others. The foundation of genuine psychological perception, the kind that allows you to actually read another person rather than simply project onto them, is self-knowledge. Not self-knowledge in the superficial sense of knowing your preferences and your habits and your personality type, but genuine self-knowledge in the Jungian sense. Knowledge of your shadow, the parts of yourself that you have not acknowledged and that are therefore actively influencing your perception without your awareness. Knowledge of your complexes, the specific constellations of emotionally charged material that were formed around early wounds and that continue to color your perception of any present-day situation that shares their structural signature. Knowledge of your persona, the social mask you have constructed, and the ways in which it both reveals and conceals who you actually are. Jung was unequivocal about this. He said that you cannot see in another person what you have not been willing to see in yourself. The accuracy of your perception of others is directly proportional to the honesty and completeness of your perception of yourself. Not because self-knowledge gives you a checklist that you can then apply to others, but because genuine self-knowledge removes the primary distorting factor that prevents accurate perception. When you know your shadow, you no longer need to project it. When you understand your complexes, you can recognize when they are being activated rather than mistaking the activation for an accurate reading of the situation. When you see through your persona, you begin to be able to see through others' personas as well, not by some mysterious transference of insight, but because the recognition of the persona structure in yourself makes it visible in others in a way that it simply was not before. A man I knew who had worked seriously with these ideas for several years described the shift in his perception of others this way. He said it was as if he had been looking at people through a frosted window for his entire adult life. He could see shapes and movements and general impressions, but nothing with real clarity, and then gradually, as the work of self-examination proceeded, the frost began to clear. Not all at once and not completely, but section by section, the window became more transparent, and what he saw through it was not what he had expected. It was not a world of people revealed to be fundamentally different from how they had seemed. It was a world of people revealed to be much more similar to himself than he had ever imagined, carrying the same kinds of unresolved material, the same kinds of compensating defenses, the same basic human hunger for something real that he had been discovering in himself. This recognition, the recognition of the common human substrate beneath the individual differences in presentation and personality, is, Jung believed, the beginning of genuine psychological perception. Not the ability to see how others are different from you, the ability to recognize how they are fundamentally similar, and to use that recognition as the basis for genuine empathic encounter. Number 3, the persona and what it tells you. Every person who is functioning in the social world is wearing a persona. This is not a criticism or an observation about inauthenticity. It is simply a recognition of the basic structure of social existence. The persona is the adaptive, presented version of the self that has been calibrated for the particular social environment in which the person moves. It includes not only the consciously constructed elements, how a person chooses to dress and speak and present themselves, but also the unconsciously adopted elements, the behavioral patterns, the emotional registers, the ways of relating to authority or to peers or to strangers that have been shaped by years of learning what the environment rewards and what it punishes. The persona itself tells you a great deal about a person, but not what most people assume it tells. The assumption is that the persona is simply an expression of the person's character, that a person who presents as confident is confident, that a person who presents as warmth-filled is genuinely warm, that what you see is, with minor adjustments for social performance, basically what is there. This assumption is the source of an enormous amount of misreading. What the persona actually tells you if you know how to read it, is something quite different. It tells you what the person believes they need to be in order to be acceptable. What qualities they have learned, through experience, are valued and welcomed in the environments they inhabit. And, by implication, what qualities have been pushed into the shadow, what aspects of who they are have been judged as unacceptable, unwelcome, or dangerous to display. The persona is not a portrait of the person. It is a map of their adaptation. And that map, read correctly, tells you as much about what is absent from the presentation as about what is present. The person who presents as relentlessly positive and energetic is often carrying a shadow filled with depression, fatigue, and the kind of dark material that the presented positivity is organized to keep out of view. The person who presents as endlessly reasonable and conflict-averse is often carrying a shadow filled with rage, and the kind of passionate conviction that has been deemed too dangerous to express directly. The person who presents as supremely self-sufficient and needing nothing from anyone is often carrying a shadow of intense need and the kind of hunger for genuine connection that the self-sufficiency was constructed to protect against acknowledging. None of this is certain or formulaic. Human psychology is too individual and too complex for any simple rule, but the general principle that Jung identified, that the shadow compensates for the persona, that what is most emphatically not present in the presentation is very often what is most powerfully present in the unconscious, is one of the most consistently useful lenses for reading another person with genuine accuracy. Number 4. The complex as the key to a person's deepest pattern. Every person has complexes, constellations of emotionally charged material, formed around early and significant experiences of pain, rejection, inadequacy, or threat that continue to operate in the unconscious long after the original experiences that created them have passed. The complex is not pathology. It is the universal human response to the inevitable difficulty of early life. When the developing psyche encountered things, it was not yet equipped to process and formed crystallizations of meaning around those encounters that persist, influencing perception and response, until they are genuinely addressed. The complex is the key to understanding the recurring patterns in a person's life. The person who keeps ending up in the same kind of difficult relationship, despite genuine effort to choose differently. The person who consistently finds themselves in conflict with authority figures, regardless of how different those figures actually are. The person who repeatedly encounters the same kind of professional obstacle in different environments and with different people in a way that begins to feel almost like fate. These recurring patterns are not accidents. They are the complex finding its object. The unresolved inner material seeking, again and again, the external situation that most closely resembles the original wound, in the hope, never quite conscious, of finally resolving what was left unresolved the first time. When you can identify a person's core complex, you have identified the organizing principle of their psychological life. Not their intelligence or their values or their personality type, though all of these are real and relevant. The core complex, the deepest wound around which the psyche has organized its defenses and its compensations and its characteristic patterns of response, is what determines the texture of their daily experience in a way that nothing else does. Reading this in another person requires a very particular quality of attention. Not analytical attention, not the scanning attention that is looking for specific signals to interpret according to a predetermined framework, but something more like receptive attention. The willingness to actually be with the person in a way that allows their patterns to register in you before you have formed a conclusion about what those patterns mean. To notice what you notice, including the reactions in yourself that the other person's presence produces, without immediately converting those noticings into judgments. Jung described this quality of attention as a kind of psychological listening that involves the whole person rather than just the intellect. The accurate perception of another person's complex does not primarily come through thinking about them. It comes through allowing yourself to be genuinely present with them, receptive to the emotional atmosphere their presence creates, attentive to the places where the energy in the conversation suddenly changes, or where the usually fluent presentation encounters unexpected difficulty. The complex, when it is activated, leaves traces in the quality of the person's engagement, that are visible to the genuinely attentive observer. Number 5. What strong emotional reactions in you reveal about the other person. One of the most counterintuitive and most practically valuable insights in Jung's entire approach to reading people is the role of your own emotional responses in the process. The conventional assumption is that your emotional responses to another person are primarily information about you rather than about them. That if you find someone irritating, the irritation tells you something about your own sensitivities rather than about the person you find irritating. This is partially true and partially a significant misunderstanding. Jung identified a phenomenon he called the participation mystique, drawn from the anthropological work of Lévi-Brühl, which describes the way in which deeply unconscious material in one person can evoke a direct, non-intellectual response in another person who is genuinely present to them. When you have a strong and immediate emotional response to someone, a response that feels disproportionate to anything they have consciously said or done, that response is frequently a signal that something in their unconscious material is resonating with something in yours. Not necessarily through projection, though projection may also be involved, but through a kind of direct psychic communication that bypasses the conscious mind entirely. This means that your own emotional responses, particularly the strong and apparently inexplicable ones, are some of the most reliable data available to you about what is actually happening in the other person's inner life. The person who makes you feel inexplicably sad, without having said or done anything sad, is often carrying sadness they have not acknowledged. The person who makes you feel inexplicably defended and vigilant, without any explicit threat, is often carrying aggression they are not consciously expressing. The person who makes you feel inexplicably light and expansive, in a way that seems to come from them, rather than from the content of the conversation, is often carrying a quality of genuine freedom or joy or creative aliveness that their persona may not be fully expressing. The key to using this information accurately is the prior work of self-examination. If you have genuinely worked with your own shadow, if you have developed a reasonably clear sense of what belongs to you and what you are bringing to encounters independently of what the other person is actually generating, you can begin to distinguish between responses that are primarily projection and responses that are primarily reception. Between what you are putting onto the person and what they are actually communicating through channels that the persona has not managed to block. Number 6. Reading the gap between what is said and what is felt. One of the most consistent findings of Jung's clinical observation was the gap, in almost every person, between what they consciously believe about their experience and what their experience actually is. The person who says they are fine and is not fine. The person who says they are angry when what they are experiencing at a deeper level is grief. The person who says they want one thing and consistently makes choices that produce the opposite. This gap is not primarily dishonesty. It is the natural consequence of the split between the conscious and the unconscious psyche. The conscious mind sincerely believes what it says. The unconscious is carrying a different reality. Reading this gap accurately is one of the most practically significant aspects of genuine psychological perception. Not in the aggressive or intrusive sense of confronting people with what you think is really going on, which serves no one and damages the possibility of genuine encounter, but in the sense of calibrating your understanding of the other person to include what they have not said rather than only to what they have said. Of understanding that the most important information about a person's inner state is very often communicated not through the content of their speech, but through its texture, through what generates animation and what produces flatness, through what is spoken with ease and what is avoided or rushed past, through the quality of energy that accompanies certain topics and is conspicuously absent from others. Jung himself was a legendary reader of this gap. People who worked with him described the experience of being understood at a level they had not known was available, not through anything intrusive or presumptuous, but through a quality of attention that somehow communicated to them that what they had not been able to say was also being heard. Number 7. The practice of genuine encounter. The capacity to read another person with genuine accuracy is, in the end, not primarily a technical skill. It is not a set of observations to be made or a framework to be applied. It is the natural consequence of a particular quality of presence, a quality that is built through the ongoing work of genuine self-examination, genuine shadow integration, and the gradual clearing of the projective screen that prevents most people from seeing others as they actually are, rather than as they need them to be. What this looks like in practice is something that most people would not immediately recognize as reading people at all. It looks like listening, genuinely, completely, without the continuous preparation of your next response, or the monitoring of the impression you are making, or the interpretive overlay of what you have already decided about this person. It looks like noticing, in a receptive rather than analytical way, the emotional texture of the interaction. What feels easy, what feels strained, what produces warmth, what produces distance. It looks like attending to your own responses, including the ones that do not obviously correspond to what is being said, with the same honest curiosity that you bring to the other person's responses. And it looks like maintaining a quality of genuine uncertainty about who this person is, a willingness to be surprised, to have your initial impression revised, to continue encountering, rather than to arrive at a conclusion and stop looking. Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. This is what genuine encounter looks like, and it is the only condition under which genuinely accurate reading of another person is possible. Not the encounter that keeps you entirely safe and entirely in control of your own impression, but the encounter that involves genuine risk. The risk of actually being present, actually being affected, actually being changed by what you encounter. The risk that genuine contact always carries, and that is also, precisely, what makes genuine perception possible. If you have found in this exploration a recognition of something you have been reaching toward in your own experience of other people, perhaps a sense that what you have been looking for in understanding others begins with something quite different from what you expected, leave a word in the comments. Not an explanation, just what you recognized, because the recognition itself is where genuine understanding always begins. And if you want to continue developing the quality of attention that makes genuine psychological perception possible, stay close to this work, not to read people for advantage, but to encounter them, fully and honestly, as the genuinely complex and genuinely human beings they are. There is considerably more to say about what the practice of genuine encounter actually requires in daily life, and what happens to the quality of your relationships and your understanding of people when it becomes the consistent basis of how you engage with the world. Because the account given in the sections above describes a capacity that sounds, when described in these terms, like it might belong to therapists and depth psychologists, rather than to ordinary people navigating ordinary relationships and ordinary professional environments. And this is a misunderstanding that deserves to be directly corrected. The capacity for genuine psychological perception that Jung is describing is not a professional skill. It is a human one. It is the capacity that every person possesses in potential and that is suppressed, not developed, by the ordinary conditions of contemporary social life. The busyness that prevents genuine presence, the social pressure to maintain smooth surfaces rather than allowing genuine contact, the constant outward orientation that leaves no space for the kind of interior work that removes projection and allows real perception, the culture of judgment that makes genuine curiosity about another person's inner life feel dangerous or inappropriate. When these conditions are allowed to govern how you engage with people, the natural human capacity for genuine psychological perception does not develop. It remains latent, covered over by the habits and the defenses and the reflexive projections that social life both requires and rewards. The extraordinary quality of perception that Jung himself possessed, and that people who work seriously with his ideas begin to develop, is not the result of a special talent that was always there. It is the result of consistent and genuine work on the conditions that prevent ordinary human perception from being as clear as it naturally can be. The most important of these conditions is the willingness to be genuinely uncertain, to approach another person, even a person you have known for years, with the quality of open attention that comes from not having already decided who they are. Most of what passes for understanding other people is not actually perception of them. It is the application of existing categories. This person is like my father. This person is the kind of person who always does that. This person reminds me of someone I once trusted and was wrong to trust. These categorizations happen instantly and without conscious deliberation, and they are among the most reliable sources of systematic misreading available to the human mind. Genuine uncertainty means suspending these categories long enough to actually look, not abandoning them permanently, because some pattern recognition is genuinely useful and is the product of real experience, but holding them lightly enough that they do not prevent you from seeing what is actually in front of you, rather than what your previous experience has prepared you to expect. A woman I knew described the moment she understood this in practical terms. She had been engaged with Jung's ideas for about 2 years, and had been developing a greater awareness of her own projections when she had an encounter with a colleague she had disliked for years. She had a very clear and very settled sense of who this person was, competitive, superficial, not genuinely interested in others. And then, in a conversation that went differently from any previous one, she noticed something she had not noticed before, a quality of genuine sadness that was visible briefly before it was covered, a reference to a difficulty at home that was mentioned, and then immediately retracted. A moment of authentic rather than performed engagement that lasted only a few seconds before the familiar persona reassembled itself. She said that what she felt in that moment was not that she had been wrong about the person, exactly, but that she had been seeing an incomplete picture that she had mistaken for the complete one. The competition and the superficiality were real, but they were covering something also real that she had never noticed because she had stopped looking when she formed her first conclusion. This is what genuine psychological perception makes available, not the replacement of difficult people with discovered hidden depths that excuse their behavior, but the enlargement of the picture, the recognition that the persona, however irritating or disappointing or genuinely difficult to be around, is not the complete reality of the person, that underneath it there is a psyche carrying its own history, its own wounds, its own complexity, its own reaching towards something real that the current mode of adaptation has not yet been able to adequately express. This recognition does not require you to respond differently to behavior that is genuinely problematic. It does not require you to pretend that what is difficult is not difficult, but it changes the quality of your response. It moves it from the reactive judgment that sees only what is presented to the more accurate and more compassionate perception that sees both what is presented and what is behind the presentation. And this more complete perception is not only more accurate, it is more useful for understanding what is actually happening in any given interaction, for navigating complex relationships with more skill and less unnecessary conflict, for offering, when it is appropriate and when you are genuinely able, the kind of response that meets what is actually there, rather than what the surface has declared to be there. Jung believed that this quality of genuine psychological perception was one of the most important contributions an individual human being could make to the collective health of the communities they inhabited, not through any grand intervention or public effort, but through the ordinary daily practice of genuinely seeing the people they were in contact with, of responding to the reality of other people's inner lives rather than to the convenient simplifications of their persona, of maintaining, in the ordinary encounters of an ordinary life, the quality of genuine attention that allows real contact to occur. This is harder than it sounds. It requires the sustained and genuinely demanding work of self-examination that removes the projective distortion. It requires the willingness to tolerate uncertainty about people rather than rushing to the comfort of settled judgment. It requires the development of a quality of emotional receptivity that the ordinary conditions of contemporary life consistently discourage. And it requires, perhaps most of all, the genuine valuing of other people's psychological reality as something worth genuinely attending to, something important enough to be worth the significant investment of real presence that genuine attention always demands. But the return on that investment, in the quality of your understanding of the people around you, in the depth and the reality of your relationships, in the simple but genuinely significant satisfaction of actually encountering another person rather than endlessly encountering your own projections wearing their face, is, in Jung's experience, and in the experience of everyone who has genuinely pursued this kind of development, more than adequate compensation for everything it requires. It is, in fact, one of the most richly rewarding forms of engagement with the world that a human being is capable of, because at its heart it is not a skill at all. It is simply the full, honest, genuinely attentive presence of one real person to another, and that, when it is genuinely available, changes everything about how the encounter feels and what becomes possible within it. There is one more dimension of reading people that Jung's framework illuminates, and it is perhaps the most practically actionable of all the ideas explored in this conversation. It concerns the specific question of what to pay attention to in the first moments of an encounter before the persona has had time to fully reassemble itself, and before your own projective tendencies have had time to settle into their habitual patterns. Jung observed that people are most psychologically legible in moments of transition and in moments of genuine surprise, in the first few seconds of an encounter, before the social presentation has been fully activated, in the moment immediately following unexpected news or unexpected difficulty, before the managed response has replaced the spontaneous one, in the instant when someone is asked a question they were not prepared for, before they have had time to formulate the answer that their persona would prefer to give. In these transitional moments, the gap between the persona and the actual inner life narrows briefly, and what is genuinely there becomes visible in a way that is not typically available in the more composed and more managed exchanges of ordinary social interaction. This does not mean studying people in a predatory or intrusive way. It means maintaining the quality of genuine receptive attention that allows these moments to be noticed when they occur naturally in the course of normal interaction. It means not being so occupied with your own presentation and your own management of the interaction that you miss the brief moments of genuine legibility that the other person's presence offers. What you are looking for in these moments is not confirmation of an existing conclusion. It is the quality of the emotional atmosphere that the person creates their unguarded state. The emotional atmosphere is a reliable carrier of unconscious material in a way that conscious speech very often is not. The quality of sadness or anxiety or genuine aliveness or defended caution that a person generates in their unguarded moments communicates something about their inner state that is considerably more accurate than what they communicate through deliberate presentation. Jung also placed considerable importance on what he called the symptomatic act, the small, apparently accidental behavior that occurs in moments when attention is not being managed, the object moved from one place to another for no apparent reason, the brief expression that crosses the face and is immediately suppressed, the sentence that is started and not finished, the hesitation that occurs in an otherwise fluent account of something. These small moments are not meaningless. They are points at which the unconscious briefly breaks through the managed surface, and they carry information that the conscious mind has not sanctioned for communication. Reading these moments accurately requires the same foundation that all accurate psychological perception requires. Self-knowledge, reduced projection, genuine presence, receptive rather than analytical attention. But it also requires a specific quality of patience. The willingness to observe without immediately interpreting, to let what you notice accumulate before you form a conclusion, to hold the ambiguity of an incomplete picture long enough for the picture to develop more fully rather than rushing to fill in the missing elements from your own assumptions. This patience is not passivity. It is the active discipline of genuine attention, the discipline of continuing to look and continuing to notice and continuing to remain genuinely uncertain about what you are seeing, even after you have noticed things that feel like they are resolving toward a clear conclusion. Because the most important thing that Jung's decades of clinical experience taught him about reading people was this: the person who appears fully legible to you is not fully legible. The person who seems simple is not simple. The person who presents as entirely transparent is always carrying more than is visible. And the moment you conclude that you have fully understood someone, you have stopped seeing them and started seeing only your conclusion about them. Genuine psychological perception is never finished. It is always provisional, always subject to revision, always dependent on the quality of continued presence and continued genuine attention that allows new information to register and previous conclusions to be updated. This is not a limitation of the capacity. It is its most essential feature. Because the person in front of you is not a problem to be solved or a character to be identified. They are a living, changing, perpetually more complex than fully visible human being. And the encounter with that complexity, genuinely maintained, genuinely honored, is the only thing that deserves to be called truly reading another person. The capacity to do this consistently, to bring genuine presence and genuine receptivity and genuine willingness to be surprised to every significant encounter, is perhaps the most valuable interpersonal capacity a human being can develop. Not because it gives you power over others, or because it allows you to navigate social environments with superior effectiveness, though it may do both of those things incidentally, but because it makes genuine contact possible, the kind of contact between two people that leaves both of them feeling actually met rather than merely managed, actually encountered rather than simply processed. And it is this quality of genuine encounter, available only when the projection has been reduced and the presence has been genuinely offered, that is, finally, what reading another person actually means. And so we return at the end to where we began. The person who walks into a room and within minutes has formed an impression that turns out to be consistently, almost mysteriously accurate. What they are doing is not mysterious at all once you understand it. They are not running faster analytical processes than other people or accessing some special reservoir of interpersonal data. They are simply less in the way, less encumbered by the projective habits and the defensive patterns and the reflexive judgments that prevent most people from actually seeing who is in front of them. They have done enough work on themselves, enough honest engagement with their own shadow and their own complexes and their own characteristic distortions, that the window between them and the other person is considerably less frosted than it is for most. And through that clearer window, what is actually there becomes visible in a way that feels, from the outside, like an exceptional gift. From the inside, it feels like simply paying attention. This is what Jung was pointing toward across the entire arc of his clinical and theoretical work. Not a set of techniques for analyzing others, but a depth of self-knowledge that allows others to be genuinely seen. Not a method for reading people, but a quality of presence that makes genuine reading possible. Not a skill, finally, but a way of being with people. One that is available to anyone who is willing to do the genuinely demanding work of becoming more fully and more honestly present, first to themselves and then, as a natural consequence, to everyone they encounter. That work begins today, if you are willing to let it begin, with the simplest and most difficult act available to a person who wants to genuinely understand others, the act of turning honestly toward yourself first, of asking with genuine curiosity rather than judgment what you are carrying that might be coloring your perception of the person in front of you, what you are bringing to the encounter that belongs to you rather than to them, what the window looks like from your side, what cleaning it might require. This is where it starts, and it is, for anyone who commits to it, where everything about how you see and are seen by the people in your life begins, quietly and permanently, to change.